welcome to Ask Me Anything. This is actually take 3. The first time a picture fell off the wall behind me spontaneously, and the second time I realised I hadn't got my microphone plugged in. So here we go. Today's questions are on space exploration, and my wife is very kindly going to read the questions. So here we go.
Lawrence, when do you think man will land on Mars?
Well, do you know, I think I'll be very surprised if humans land on Mars before 2050. So it's about 30 years' time. The reason is that getting to Mars is such an incredible challenge. I mean, to fly to the moon, it takes 3 days. To get to Mars is about 6 months, which is about 180 days. So it's about 60 times as long. So you'd have to carry the food, the water, the oxygen for such a long voyage. But the real showstopper for a Mars mission is solar radiation. Okay, the sun periodically spews out material as solar flares, and we experience that as radiation. And the Apollo program was incredibly lucky. I think one of the Apollo missions just missed a solar flare. And if it had struck while the astronauts had been flying between the Earth and the Moon, they probably all would have got a really almost deadly dose of radiation. So that's the real problem, to actually be 6 months in space, uh, vulnerable to flares and solar radiation. I mean, you can shield yourself. You could shield yourself with, lead shielding, but of course that adds to the weight of the rocket. So you need more fuel. So that's a real problem. So to answer your question, I'd be really surprised if people land on Mars in my lifetime. So that's by about 2050. Maybe in your lifetime, I don't know.
Karen XXX, what tourist site would you most like to visit in the solar system?
Well, for me, there's only really one tourist site, and that is Saturn's Rings. I mean, they are fantastically spectacular. I mean, 4 planets in the solar system have rings, but the ones around Saturn are by far the most impressive. When Galileo first turned his telescope on Saturn from Padua in about 1610, he was completely baffled. First of all, he thought the planet had 2 moons, a moon on either side. But then when he looked in the following year, the moons had vanished. Of course, we now know why, and that is the rings are incredibly thin. If they were around the Earth, they would stretch something like a third of the way to the moon, and yet they are probably only about 10, 20 meters thick. So really, if they were shrunk to be just a kilometre across, they would be thinner than a razor blade. So Galileo, when he turned his telescope on Saturn and its rings were oriented in such a way that they were edge on, they completely vanished. Now, the rings were a huge puzzle, and it was James Clerk Maxwell, the Scottish physicist, who in the 19th century was able to show that they could not be liquid or solid. And we now know they are made of countless quadrillion chunks of tumbling ice. Really, the rings are a massive collection of micro moons. And one of the great mysteries, of course, is why they are so bright. They reflect something like 99% of the sunlight that falls on them, so they're brilliantly white. And the explanation for that is that they are made of ice. But this raises a puzzle, because as time goes by, the rings should be pounded by micrometeorites, by dust, and they should get dirty, and yet they're pristine and white. So that kind of indicates that they must be very young, probably only a few 100 million years old. So sometime maybe a few 100 million years ago, at the most, an icy moon of Saturn, perhaps a few 100 kilometres across, was shattered by maybe moving too close to Saturn and produced the rings. But that again creates a mystery, because if the rings of Saturn are recent and only a few 100 million years old, then that means they've only existed for maybe 3 or 4 or even 5% of the history of the solar system. So you have to ask yourself, how come we're lucky enough to be around to see them?
life anywhere else in the solar system?
Well, if that question had been asked in maybe the early 1970s, we would have said almost certainly no, because we were thinking about life as we knew it on planet Earth. And the other worlds in the solar system are pretty harsh compared to the Earth. So, for instance, Venus has an atmosphere 100 times thicker than the Earth's, crushing down with 100 times the pressure on the surface. It has sulfuric acid clouds. It has a surface temperature hot enough to melt lead. So it didn't look as if the solar system was a good place to find life. But what changed everything was were discoveries made on Earth by Bob Ballard and his submersible Alvin. And what he discovered were volcanic vents on the sea floor many kilometres down. And around these hot vents, out of which was gushing material, sulfur and carbon and all kinds of stuff from the interior of the Earth, was an ecology of bacteria and giant tube worms about the size of your arm. And all of these organisms were living without sunlight. They were obtaining their energy from sulfur compounds without sunlight. And since then, we've discovered simple life many kilometres down in solid rock in mines. We found life in the Atacama Desert, in the Antarctic. There's nowhere on Earth where simple life is not surviving. So this has completely changed our view of the rest of the solar system. So Mars, on a very hot summer's day, gets to just about freezing. So it's kind of like the Antarctic, although its atmosphere is carbon dioxide, only about 1% as thick as the Earth. So life could survive on Mars, if not on the surface, then beneath the surface. And we certainly know that Mars, because it's a smaller world than the Earth, cooled more quickly after its formation. And there is evidence today that in the distant past there were rivers and oceans on Mars. So it would have been a place, a habitable place before the Earth was. So life could have got started on Mars before it got started on the Earth. As the climate deteriorated, it's not a good place today, it may have crept beneath the surface. But probably the best places to find life are the subsurface oceans of the giant moons of the gas giant planets in the outer solar system, particularly Europa, which is a moon of Jupiter. We can see that it is surrounded in a thick layer of ice. We think it's about 10 kilometres thick, but the rotation of this world tells us that it's got liquid inside. So there may be an ocean 100 kilometres deep beneath the surface layer of ice. That makes it the biggest ocean in the solar system. And because of these discoveries on Earth that life can survive in complete darkness, it could be living in the ocean of Europa. Certainly, we would expect there to be volcanic vents on the seafloor just like on the Earth. And Ganymede is believed to have an internal ocean, a salty ocean as well. And even more intriguing, Enceladus, which is a very small moon of Saturn, was discovered to have ice fountains by the Cassini spacecraft. And that tells us that there is the smallest ocean in the solar system beneath the surface of the icy surface of Enceladus. And Enceladus is really tiny, only about the size of southern England. So there's a lot of hope, really, that there will be life found elsewhere in the solar system, a second biology.
Kieran Frost, has the solar system ever been visited by aliens?
Well, this is a big question, isn't it, really? Um, Obviously, in the 2001 A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke, um, the premise of the whole story is that aliens did come through our solar system several million years ago and assisted our ancestors in learning how to use tools. And they left a beacon, a kind of baby alarm on the moon. And in the opening scenes of 2001 A Space Odyssey, this baby alarm is unearthed on the moon and sends a signal back to its makers. So it's quite plausible that there's other intelligent life in our galaxy, but it's more than likely that it's a long way away from us or it's separated from us in time. So it's conceivable that our solar system could have been visited maybe millions or hundreds of millions of years ago, and it's conceivable that some kind of beacon might have been left. But how would we recognise it, and where would it be? I just worked out how many uh, cubic kilometres of empty space there are in our solar system, and it's a million cubic kilometres. And we've explored only a tiny, tiny portion of that. So who knows? There could be an alien baby alarm waiting for us to discover. But I think what's more than likely is there is actually an alien artifact on the Earth. An Ukrainian astronomer called Alexei Arkhipov made this very simple argument. He said our space junk is ejected from the solar system. So, for instance, if a spacecraft explodes, then bits of debris fly out of our solar system. Collisions between rockets and satellites do the same. And so he extrapolates to the rest of the galaxy. And just as our junk uh, flies out of the solar system, if there are other extraterrestrial intelligences, other extraterrestrial civilizations, their junk will come our way. He makes a few assumptions. So, for instance, he assumes that maybe 1 in 10,000 stars in our galaxy has a technological civilization at some time in its history. He then assumes that it converts something like 1% of the raw material in its solar system, maybe in its asteroid belt, into technological artifacts, and he then extrapolates to find out how much stuff should have fallen to Earth. And obviously there's a great all these numbers are guesses, but he does come to the conclusion that we would expect several alien artifacts, maybe the size of a Marmite jar, to have actually fallen to Earth in the last 4.5 billion years, so the age of the Earth. The problem, of course, is finding such an artifact. How would we even recognise it? One of the problems is that most of the Earth is covered by ocean, and the land is constantly reformed. It's weathered, there's volcanism, there's tectonic activity with plates diving back into the interior of the Earth. So where would we actually find such an artifact? But in my daydreams, I kind of imagine that somewhere on Earth at this moment, someone has just unearthed an odd object in their garden, and they're looking at it completely puzzled.